I'm Steve Allen, or Dr. Stephen J. Allen, if you want to be formal. I've covered political conventions going back many years. I've 10 national political conventions, counting Republican and Democrat. In fact, for show and tell, I have my credentials from this past year for the 2 political conventions. And I started out as a reporter when I was 16, working my way through school, so I've been writing about politics for a long time. Nothing compares to this election in terms of the stakes and the twists and the turns and the surprise ending, like a movie. Through the fall campaign, most predictions were like this one in the Washington Post, October 18th, by a respected political analyst. Trump's path to an electoral college victory isn't narrow, it's non-existent. We were assured that the Trump campaign had melted down, that Republicans were fleeing the Trump disaster. And the big concern was that those crazy Trump supporters, the big concern was what they would do when they lost. The week of the election, conservative publications told us the Republicans were going to get blown up like Wile E. Coyote or crushed by a Democratic wave. This was the New York Times estimate of Trump's chance from June until the November election. 15% chance for Trump as of Election Day. And as everyone knows, if there's only a 15% chance of something happening, it absolutely cannot happen. That's how it works, right? 15% chance never comes in. This was on the newsstands the week of the election, that Trump would end up a loser, and Hillary Clinton would be Madam President. This was the Newsweek commemorative issue that was not supposed to be released, but some of us got copies. And I don't know, I hear they're going up on eBay. So I'm going to hide that copy before anybody steals it. By the way, that Meltdown cover of Time Magazine won the Magazine Editor's Award for Cover of the Year, because you never let truth get in the way of a good magazine cover. Look, I know how they talked themselves into this. Of the 270 electoral votes needed to win, 242 were in 18 states plus the District of Columbia that Democrats had carried in 6 consecutive elections. Pundits called it the blue wall. On Election Day, Clinton aides, understandably, they were on the campaign plane. They opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate. The New York Times at that point had her with an 85% chance to win. She had an 89% chance of winning Pennsylvania, a 93% chance of winning Wisconsin, and a 94% chance of winning Michigan. She would lose them all. At the Jacob Javits Convention Center in New York City, people gathered for a Clinton victory party. The center was the perfect choice with a glass ceiling that recalled the metaphorical glass ceiling often noted by Clinton as a barrier to the advancement of women. Cannons were set up on either side of the main floor to shoot green confetti. That was to simulate the shattering of the glass ceiling. At first, things seemed to be going as expected. States that were supposed to go to Clinton were going to Clinton. And there were lots of happy people at Clinton headquarters and a sparse crowd at the Trump party less than 2 miles away at the Midtown Hilton. But around 9 p.m. Eastern, things began to change. It wasn't just that Trump was doing better than expected in Ohio, winning easily, and in Virginia, where Trump led early on before falling behind. It was the pattern that was striking fear into the hearts of people in the Clinton campaign. Trump was doing better than expected among college-educated voters and among women. He actually carried so-called white college graduates and white women, and he was winning by more than 2-to-1 among the so-called white working class, the kind of people whose votes would decide those battleground states. By 9:24 p.m., Clinton's 85% chance of victory had fallen to 59%. At 9:31 p.m. Eastern, Trump became the front runner. At 9:48, Maggie Haberman of the New York Times tweeted, "If Trump wins, it will be the upset of the last 50 years." By 10 p.m., Clinton's chance of winning was 37%, and then the bottom fell out. And you can see there, it just plummeted. I was in an election party, and I kept hitting the refresh button on the New York Times website, and every time they had a little meter which you saw there a second ago, a little meter that showed Trump's chance. And every time it would go to 0 when you refreshed it, and then it would gradually move up to what the current prediction was. So every time I thought, oh, well, this thing's fixed now, and it's over there at 10% or 0 or something like that. But then it kept going up, and finally it was above 95%, and it stayed there. And this scene we all remember. Even NBC news producers were seen putting their heads down and sobbing. Everyone who's been in politics for a long time has had an experience like this. The worst thing that can happen to you in politics is to lose when you thought you were going to win. Of course, the best thing is when you win and you thought you were going to lose. In this case, it was made much worse by all the predictions and all the certainty. So, what happened? Let's start with the predictions of how states were going to vote. A lot of it, I believe, was wishful thinking on the part of the media. Their own data showed that the election was close, but they chose repeatedly to interpret that data in the way that they considered most favorable. During the campaign, I kept track of all the prognosticators, the Nate Silvers and Larry Sabato's. I looked at the prediction markets where you could get odds on how the election was going to go. You could bet on the outcome, in fact. I came up with a way of digitizing the predictions so that the predictions in different formats could be averaged together. And I consistently got this as the consensus prediction. Now, this is what actually happened. So I'll go back and forth a little bit so you can see the difference. Right. And this is what we're discussing. These are the states that made the difference. Florida, 29 electoral votes, North Carolina, 15, Pennsylvania, 20, Michigan, 16, Wisconsin, 10, plus the second congressional district in Maine, which had its own electoral vote. Now, the only difference in the predictions was North Carolina and Florida, and then the 3 Rust Belt states, as you see there. That made the difference in the campaign. Of the 91 electoral votes here on this list, Trump needed 55 to win. That would be, as I say, Florida and North Carolina is 44, and then you get one of the other states. If it's Wisconsin, then you also needed that one electoral vote in Maine, which is why the Trump campaign spent so much time on the campaign in rural Maine, which they were ridiculed for, but that could have made the difference in the final result. Now, in the world of professional campaign consultants, there is a grudging respect for people on the other side, people who are smart, who know their stuff. Sometimes after a campaign, you'll run into folks from the other side and you'll swap war stories like Union and Confederate soldiers at that 1913 Gettysburg reunion. Every 4 years, the Kennedy School at Harvard hosts a get-together for the campaign managers of the two sides in the presidential campaign. This past year, the get-together turned into a near shouting match. You see the expressions on Kellyanne Conway's face, and part of that, I'm told, was that part of it was that the Democrats were pushing the racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic angle of the election, and also Russia. But part of it, I'm told, was that the Trump side didn't have much respect for the Clinton people as professionals in the field. One of the clear contrasts was the messages of the two campaigns. Donald Trump, beyond anything else, is the master of branding. Trump this, Trump that, to the point that his name is a big part of his assets. In the 1990s, there was a point at which his business empire was falling apart. There was a deep recession. People weren't going to Trump's Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City. The Plaza Hotel and the Trump Shuttle were in bad shape financially. He and his companies reportedly owed $3 billion. As one author put it, bankers held gigantic meetings at Trump Tower with like 40 banks all sitting around in a room, Donald very sober. The bankers' problem was that Trump's assets were worth more with his name on them than in foreclosure. So they were basically stuck with him. He was too big to fail from their perspective. And he got time, because of that, to rebuild his fortune and write a sequel to The Art of the Deal entitled The Art of the Comeback. It tells you something about how the members of the media elite see things, that in the joint biography of Trump and Clinton that ran on PBS, this part of the story is presented as Trump snookering people, getting out of his debts. The suggestion is that he's not really a businessman, and there's this ominous presentation zooming in on black and white pictures from that time, tilting the camera angle, building the drama, the sense of Trump as Caligula. I'm sitting there watching it. Wow, that guy's pretty clever. Lots of people lost their fortunes back then, and Trump survived because he understood the value of branding. Perhaps the best branding effort of this campaign harkened back to the Reagan campaign of 1980. Anyone notice anything about this poster?
The last 4 words.
Let's make America great again. Trump started using the slogan on November 7th, 2012, the day after Mitt Romney lost to President Obama. Trump registered it with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office 5 days later. So Trump had a simple 4-word slogan, one that tied him to the most popular Republican president of recent decades, which is important if you're running as a Republican and you had recently been a Democrat. It was a slogan that conveyed a clear message that resonated with lots of people and that could fit on hats. In fact, it was so recognizable that people just started calling it MAGA. All his themes could be played as variations. At the Republican National Convention, each day had a theme like Make America Safe Again or Make America Work Again. Now to the Clinton campaign. Does anybody know what this is? This is the list of 84 slogans that were proposed for the Clinton campaign. There were 85 on the list, but one actually appeared twice and nobody noticed because there were so many of them. Progress for the rest of us. Wasn't that in Seinfeld? No, that was Festivus. Move up. Move ahead. Keep moving. No quit. And my favorite, next begins with you, which it actually doesn't, but anyway. I thought of Ted Kennedy's 1979 interview, which was disastrous, with Roger Mudd from CBS News, where Kennedy was unable to answer the question, why do you want to be president? So Hillary Clinton runs against the guy who wrote the book on branding, wrote the foreword in the first chapter of the book on branding, the guy who picked his campaign slogan 4 years before the election so that everything in the campaign could be tied to the slogan, and the best her campaign can do is throw words together almost at random. To illustrate this, I did a couple of word clouds. Here is Hillary's slogans. Something about progress making a better America stronger as we move ahead into the fight for future times for our families, new and fair. Now here's the word cloud for the Trump campaign. Or side by side, something of a contrast. Twice as much money is not enough of an advantage if you don't know what your message is. Okay, so why was the Clinton campaign so sloppy? Part of it, I think, was the overconfidence. Part was something you see throughout the Clintons' careers of putting people in key positions based on loyalty rather than competence. Think of Craig Livingstone, who was put in charge of personnel security at the Clinton White House. Those of us old enough will remember this scandal. Hundreds of raw FBI files on Republicans were found at the White House, and Livingstone was either responsible, maybe, or he was the fall guy, depending on which version you believe. The point is that this is the person in charge of checking out the people who work on the White House staff to make sure you don't get, a spy or a crazy person. It's a very important job. And he had no known qualifications except as a bouncer and as a limo driver for the Clinton campaign. I met him at one point. He seemed like a nice guy, but he had no business in that job. This lack of seriousness, I think, played a role in the WikiLeaks affair, which did a major blow to the Clinton campaign. As far back as 2008, during the Obama transition, Dennis McDonough, the Obama chief of staff, warned Clinton operative John Podesta, the guy in the picture, about discussing sensitive matters on unsecure systems. He said, "I know I'm like a broken record on this, but I think we should arrange a briefing on the cyber threat for all associated with your effort. We have a real security threat on our stuff here." That's 2008 that Podesta was warned. The Clinton campaign turned down help from both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security during the 2016 campaign. In fact, the FBI warned Democrats of Russia hacking at least as far back as September 2015. The Clinton campaign's attitude toward cybersecurity is reflected in the username and password on the desktop computer of campaign manager, campaign chairman John Podesta. Can you guess what his username and password were? This is the WikiLeaks that revealed it. Username, J. Podesta. Password, P@SSW0RD. Not exactly an eye on cybersecurity, I think. Then there's the phishing, Phishing, that may have changed the course of history. On March 19th last year, the IT folks in the campaign got an alert that someone in Ukraine was trying to change the password on Podesta's Gmail account. It was a fake warning with a fake password reset page that would capture his password. Responding to the warning that had been forwarded to him, IT employee Charles Delavan wrote, "This is a legitimate email." He later said he meant to type, "This is an illegitimate email," which I think may make Delavan the Bill Buckner of American politics. Critical mistake that changed everything. Now, this is a picture of Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks guy. So what was the WikiLeaks? What was in there? There was a lot. That there was collusion between the news media and the Clinton campaign, everything from unethically running stories by the campaign for approval to leaking debate questions. That the Democratic National Committee had taken the side of Hillary against Bernie, which revelation led to the resignations of the Democratic Party chair, the CFO, the CEO, and the communications director. That even Chelsea was concerned about improprieties in the Clinton Foundation, which led one of Bill Clinton's aides, Doug Band, to snap back that, well, she hadn't been such a stickler when they were helping pay for her wedding. There were insults directed at conservatives who converted to Catholicism. A discussion of the need to reform the Catholic Church ideologically, talk of going after Bernie Sanders based on his religion, and the revelation that the Clinton campaign in 2008 focus group tested a question about the Muslim background of Barack Obama's father. There was a memo detailing what was referred to as Bill Clinton Incorporated, showing how the Clinton Foundation and Clinton Global Initiative indirectly helped provide a huge income for Bill Clinton. Remember that the Clintons made something like $240 million in 15 years after Bill left the White House. There was discussion of $12 million from the King of Morocco that was contingent on Hillary attending a Clinton Foundation summit in Morocco. This is while she was Secretary of State. Remember the separate revelation by the Associated Press that of the non-government individuals who met with or had phone conversations with Clinton while she was Secretary of State in the 2 years for which the records were released, 55% were Clinton Foundation donors. And I'm not talking about $14 a month, to Sally Struthers to save hungry children. We're talking about an average of $1.8 million each for the 55% who were Clinton Foundation donors. Another revelation involved the Clinton Foundation accepting a $1 million gift from the terrorism funding government of Qatar while Hillary was Secretary of State without informing the State Department about such things as they had promised. And that money was the $1 million was a 65th birthday present for Bill. We learned that President Obama connected with Hillary through the private email system, meaning that he seems to have known about the setup. There was her meeting with Brazilian bankers for which Clinton was paid $225,000, in which she admitted that my dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. Various fact checkers had called Trump a liar for saying that that was Hillary's position. Then there was the speech in which Hillary discussed the need for a politician to have both a public position and a private position on issues. We learned that the lowering of AIDS drug prices in poor countries, which was the big thing that the Clinton Foundation bragged about, was, as some of us had suggested, part of an implicit deal not to put pressure on the companies to allow generic AIDS drugs and cheaper and have lower prices in the U.S. and Europe. So more expensive prices in the U.S. and Europe, which paid for the cheaper AIDS drugs in the third world, but they left out the part about the more expensive prices, the higher prices in the U.S. and Europe. That Hillary, in a paid speech in 2013, said that Jordan and Turkey can't possibly vet all those refugees. So they don't know if jihadists are coming in along with legitimate refugees. There's lots more, but you get the point. None of this would have come out if they had been more careful. Now, to be fair, Hillary had lots going for her. Many people considered her the most well-credentialed person ever to run for president. She served on the staff of the House Judiciary Committee during the effort to impeach Nixon. By age 30, she was the chair of the government-funded nonprofit organization, the Legal Services Corporation, that provides legal aid to the poor in civil cases. At one meeting, by the way, she referred to herself as the LSC's chairperson thing whatever. She also chaired the board of a major liberal group, the Children's Defense Fund. This picture is when she was a staff member at CDF. And, of course, she had an alien baby. Sorry, I was just seeing if you were paying attention. Illegal alien, perhaps? But seriously, she was a law professor, First Lady of Arkansas for 12 years, a partner in a top law firm. When her husband ran for president, he touted their relationship as a political partnership. Buy one, get one free, he said. And for at least part of the Clinton administration, she was, if not exactly co-president, very influential. She ran the health care reform effort during Bill's first term. And then she was, of course, a U.S. Senator and Secretary of State. But she had some negatives. She was hired as a law professor a few months after flunking the D.C. bar. You know, just like everybody else who flunks the D.C. bar. You get hired as a law professor a few months later. She was hired at the prestigious Rose Law Firm when her husband became state attorney general, and then became a partner when he became governor. And that health care effort that she ran was such a disaster, it helped bring the Republicans to power in the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. And there was a never-ending string of scandals. There was the cattle futures deal. This picture is from the so-called Pretty in Pink press conference at which Hillary tried to explain herself. I have a 17,000-word piece on our website, capitalresearch.org, entitled The Clinton Method, where I suggest that all the later scandals from Whitewater and the Travel Office and Filegate all the way up to the emails have their roots in the cattle futures deal. The deal was when the largest polluter in the state of Arkansas created a fake commodities account to funnel $400,000 in today's money to Hillary, beginning 3 weeks before the 1978 governor's election, when Bill had a 30-point lead. Everybody knew he was going to win. And by the way, no one has ever challenged my reporting. Okay, this is unchallenged by people on the other side. And I name names, I give dates and everything. Look, I'm reluctant to mention such things. I know there are some Hillary supporters in the room who are still hurting. I would ask that you take this to understand why people on the Trump side were so frustrated, why they chant, lock her up, when they see her getting away with, as they see it, stealing 66,000 government documents, many of them highly sensitive, putting them on an unsecured server, and destroying half of them. So put yourself in the position of somebody who sees it that way. So let's talk about Trump, someone else with both positive and negative qualities. A brash billionaire married 3 times with a reputation as a womanizer, his girlfriend boasting about the best sex I've ever had on the front page of the newspaper. He was a frequent guest on Howard Stern's radio show, a member of the World Wrestling Entertainment Hall of Fame. By the way, don't make fun of wrestling. My mother went into labor with me while watching wrestling, okay? True, that's true. He was the owner of casinos and, of course, the host of a hit reality TV show, The Apprentice, The Celebrity Apprentice. That's the most famous contestant, Omarosa, who's now Director of Communications for the Office of Public Liaison in the White House. So I guess you can get a job for the TV show, The Apprentice. He had never run for office or served in the cabinet or the military. Every president had served as an elected official or a cabinet member or a general. He had all the baggage that came from decades in the real estate business in New York and around the world, often greasing the palms of politicians to get what he needed. In fact, he had been a backer of Senator Clinton, who came to his wedding. So where does this guy get off running for president of the United States? Trump's positives, I'll get to this picture on the screen in a moment, his positives included his reputation as a negotiator, and an intimidating one at that. His background as a political chameleon, a Republican, a Democrat, a Reform Party member, a social liberal, a guy who had contributed to Chuck Schumer as well as to Hillary Clinton. The fact that he was not a career politician, but had paid off enough politicians over the years to understand the corrupt system. His status as a billionaire who could fund his own campaign and, people would say, can't be bought. His mastery of branding, his improvisational style, which gave him an amazing ability to connect with people, but also got him in a lot of trouble. and his decades in the public eye, which made it hard to smear him or even to hurt him with charges that were true, because people had already taken those things, like the womanizing, into account. After the 2005 Access Hollywood tape, which you see there, many experts echoed the words of Republican consultant Steve Schmidt, who said the presidential race is effectively over. Mediaite reported that the Republican National Committee had already redirected funds away from the Trump campaign to further down ballot candidates in the hope of saving the party after Trump went belly up. So I heard, though, from people all through this, I heard from people who said, of course he told Billy Bush that his wealth and fame made him irresistible to women. He's Donald Trump, for goodness sake. It's funny, when Trump would say disgusting things, that John McCain wasn't a hero. I used to work for a Vietnam POW. I was friends with another one, so I was incensed. I wrote about it. That icky business about making Kelly bleeding from her wherever. What I heard from lots of people was, better a president who goes overboard in saying what he thinks than one who lies to us all the time or who gives into the pressures of political correctness. By the way, the folks at NBC had this tape in their possession all along, springing it at the right time to maximize the hurt to the Trump campaign. This is NBC News that had this. Leaking it to the Washington Post so they could turn around and cover it objectively. Believe it or not, it was also intended to get Billy Bush out of the way because he was a leading contender to take over the Today Show eventually. So there's all kinds of internal stuff going on here too. Trump's shoot-from-the-hip attitude certainly runs against what I was taught and what I teach people over the years, have taught people in politics. One of the lessons I teach to politicians and press secretaries is what I call Allen's 7-second delay. You know, the 7-second delay was developed in radio because in the days before you had digital recording or anything like that, you could create a delay long enough to bleep out something before it goes out over the air by stringing tape from one tape recorder to the next. So one records the incoming signal and then the other plays it out over the air, and the distance between the two tape recorders, it takes 7 seconds for the tape to make that trek there, and then that gives you 7 seconds to turn it all off before that curse word goes out over the air or whatever it is. So I teach people to create that in their heads. You'd be surprised how many times I've seen politicians get halfway through a sentence. They know they're about to say something that's going to damage them, maybe ruin them, but they don't want to be embarrassed by suddenly seeming to have lost their train of thought. So they keep talking, and they're ruined. And I tell them, just don't be embarrassed. Just say, oh gosh, I forgot what I was about to say. Sorry. It's a lot better to do it that way. Now go back and look at that announcement speech of Trump. He was mostly winging it, where he talked about Mexican illegal aliens and said they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Now, he had just seen the news report, by the way, about the people smuggling in aliens into the country. Some of them had raped the women that they were smuggling in. That's what he had in his head, apparently, at that point. Nevertheless, I think he realized partway through that statement that he was in trouble, so that's why he appends the little thing at the end about some of them are good people. That didn't stop folks from saying that Trump said something like, all Mexicans are rapists, which even the Washington Post said that was an unfair characterization of that statement. But he got in trouble time and time again because he didn't use Allen's 7-second delay. Trump's style was a major reason that a lot of folks couldn't stand the thought of Trump as president, including many conservatives. National Review, the flagship magazine of the conservative movement, founded by William F. Buckley in 1955, ran a special issue attacking Trump back in January 2016. Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard claims that National Review lost a quarter of its subscribers over that issue of National Review. Yet as the election drew near, Republicans came home, and Trump ended up getting about the same share of Republican votes as Hillary got Democrat votes. How did that happen? It was the Flight 93 argument. Michael Anton, who's now the Deputy Assistant to the President for Strategic Communications at the National Security Council, wrote an article under a pseudonym, Publius Decius Mus, for a conservative intellectual publication, in which he likened the situation in the Trump-Clinton contest to the situation on board the airplane on 9/11, where the passengers fought back against the hijackers. And Rush Limbaugh took the article up, promoted it on his radio show and his website. Anton wrote, 2016 is the Flight 93 election. Charge the cockpit or you die. You may die anyway. You or the leader of your party may make it in the cockpit and not know how to fly or land the plane. There are no guarantees except one. If you don't try, death is certain. Now, was it really that important an election? A lot of people on both sides of the fence came to a reasonable conclusion that a President Hillary Clinton would have had unprecedented power. Take the Supreme Court. In the case of the 2016 election, we knew from February 13th forward, that's when Justice Scalia died, that the court was at stake. A Clinton victory would have given Democrats 5 seats, with the prospect of another one, maybe 2 if Clinton were reelected. You would have seen the overturning of Citizens United. That was a case about whether the government could block distribution of a movie made about Hillary Clinton, critical of Hillary Clinton. Often on the campaign trail, she would describe it that way. She would say, this was a movie about me. And the Supreme Court allowed this to be distributed. And she said that she would only appoint people to the Supreme Court who would overturn that decision. A Democratic majority Supreme Court would have given the new Clinton administration a blank check on most of its policies. The Paris Climate Treaty would have been deemed ratified, even though the Senate never voted on it. Remember, President Obama certified to the international authorities that the treaty had been ratified, even though the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate, and the Senate never voted on it. In fact, the one time they voted something similar in the 90s, the vote was 95-0 against it. The Paris Climate Treaty deal would have killed the coal industry, raised the price of electricity, and established the precedent that a president can make treaties without Senate approval. There would have been what my left-wing friends call a third Reconstruction, the federal government using a variety of means to break the political power of Republican-leaning states. And here's some more of what conservatives feared. The census would have been a powerful weapon in the redistribution of political power, including reclassifying Middle East, North Africa people who are currently classified as white, classifying them as minority group members, creating other minority groups. And this is important because much of everything from corporate hiring to university admissions to the drawing of political districts is based on what the government classifies as minority groups, and it's basically arbitrary. The census can classify any group of people they want, and they did that with Latinos. There's no logical basis for making Latinos a separate group, but they did, and they were planning on doing that, and in fact are in some ways still doing it with regard to Middle East, North Africa, and other classifications. Conservatives believe that if Hillary won, the IRS and the Department of Justice would have been unleashed on the Clintons' opponents, and the DOJ would have expanded the Obama administration practice of giving corporations double credit on paying fines if they gave money to left-wing interest groups. So this is something that the current Attorney General has ended, but the DOJ would go after people, and if you gave money to certain groups, you would get a 2-for-1 credit against the fine that you otherwise owed the federal government, and that was a good way of funding left-wing interest groups. So the fear of all of this was enough to get conservatives and Republicans in the Trump camp. So what do people on the Clinton side think happened that caused them to lose? Since the election, Hillary Clinton has been asked why she lost. She said she took responsibility, but she blamed Comey and the FBI, Putin and the Russians, Trump for colluding with them, anti-American forces, bad polls and people who assumed she'd win, misogynists, the New York Times for writing about the emails, Netflix for having too many anti-Clinton documentaries, the Democratic Party for being broke and not having good data. By the way, the data operation of the Democratic Party was so great that books have been written about it, how terrific it was, and yet somehow this was one of the deficiencies that caused Hillary to lose. Also, Hillary mentioned Facebook and Twitter and purveyors of fake news, including content farms in Macedonia and others. This is the chart that Fox News put together listing, sort of ridiculing her response on this matter. One of those explanations was fake news, but my examination indicates that more of the fake news stories that had real impact were anti-Trump than were anti-Clinton. Fake news has a long, long history. Walter Duranty won the Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times for reporting on what Stalin was up to. It turned out Stalin was giving him all the inside scoop in return for him covering up the atrocities in the Soviet Union, including the murder of millions of Ukrainians. There was the story of Kitty Genovese. Certainly the older people will remember that, the woman who was murdered and her neighbors, hearing her screams, did nothing, not even calling the police. That didn't happen. That story was basically promoted by Abe Rosenthal of the New York Times. He wrote a book about it, and in fact the neighbors acted as anybody would. They heard screams. They did call the police. She'd been dragged around the corner. They couldn't see anything. One guy actually went out and looked around to see what was going on. The neighbors acted normally, but the story became that these people had let her down, and that became a political metaphor of the 1960s. Was, well, if we don't care about this person, it's because we're like the folks who wouldn't help Kitty Genovese. 6,000 sheep killed near Dugway Proving Ground in 1968 by a botched chemical weapons test. That never happened either, but it inspired Earth Day and led to the shutdown of the U.S. chemical and biological weapons program. Matthew Shepard being killed because he was gay? No. Valerie Plame being outed by Bush political operatives? Nope, that didn't happen either, and so on. Trayvon Martin's story, the hands up, don't shoot, neither of those things happened either. Now, fake news during the campaign included Hillary's indictment is imminent. This is part of the anti-Hillary, pro-Trump fake news. Hillary's indictment is imminent. Bill Clinton was caught on video raping a 13-year-old girl. Clinton cronies run a child molestation ring out of a pizza place in Washington. The Pope endorses Trump. Robert De Niro endorses Trump. Now, those were fake stories that got out. On the other hand, there were stories that were fake that were anti-Trump and pro-Clinton. Milo Yiannopoulos, who's a gay activist who endorsed Trump, 20 minutes before he was to endorse Trump, he was banned from Twitter, and the claim was that he had started racist attacks on the actress Leslie Jones from Saturday Night Live and the Ghostbusters movie. In fact, he had criticized her very sharply, but he had nothing to do with the racist attacks. Clinton's health care, it was put out that that was a hoax. In fact, she had had a blood clot on her brain from the concussion that she had had that was the explanation for why she supposedly couldn't remember her security briefing that led to her putting the emails on the private server, was because she couldn't remember things because of this blood clot on her brain. Yet the story was put out that anybody who questioned Hillary's health in this regard was, just a conspiracy theorist who was making stuff up. The Miss Universe case where Trump supposedly said terrible things about Miss Universe, it took me about 45 minutes to show that that story was completely fake. And yet Hillary used it during one of the debates and basically won the debate right at the end by using that story against Trump. Trump not denouncing David Duke. He denounced him as far back as 2000, said he wouldn't run as the Reform Party candidate in 2000, and he specifically mentioned David Duke and how horrible David Duke was, and he didn't want to have any association with him. Trump not paying taxes for 18 years. That was actually refuted when Rachel Maddow puts on television Trump's tax return from during this period that showed that he paid a substantial amount in taxes. And on and on. The big one being Trump can't win. That was the big fake news story. There was a study a while back of basketball teams and how they reacted to being ahead or behind. And what you found was that teams that at halftime were trailing, they usually lost. But that wasn't true if they were 1 point behind. If they were 1 point behind, the team that was trailing was all fired up. We can win this. The team that's 1 point ahead, they get complacent and they end up losing. And they actually lost. The team that was 1 point ahead actually lost more often than they won. And that's a principle in politics too. If you're right behind, you usually win. But if you're way back, then you usually lose. And so they wanted to create the impression that Trump was far behind when he was actually very close behind. I actually wrote at the end of August, I said, in my view, Trump was the equivalent of one field goal behind in a football game at halftime, which is, you're a little bit behind, but you've got a really good chance of winning, nevertheless. So even after the inauguration, the fake news continued, from the Martin Luther King bust being removed from the Oval Office, which didn't happen, to the Muslim travel ban. It was terrorist hotspots. If you tried to pick those countries from a list of Muslim countries, the chance of you being able to do that at random was, I believe, 29 million to 1. To Sean Spicer denying the Holocaust. And then a lot of the stuff that's happened in the last week. Just totally mischaracterizing things that people say in order to get a political effect. And of course, the whole Russia nonsense, from Trump asking Russia to hack America, which was reported falsely by The New Yorker, NBC News, The Atlantic, Washington Post, New York Daily News, BuzzFeed, Rolling Stone, Miami Herald, CNN, Vanity Fair, and many others, to that report by 17 intelligence agencies on so-called Russia meddling, which the Associated Press finally, 6 months after the fact, admitted that it was not 17 intelligence agencies. I have a copy of the report here if you want to see it. It's basically 2.5 intelligence agencies, and even that's an exaggeration. So, and I have here, if you want to see how people can flip on a dime to make a political point, this is Time magazine. Russia wants to undermine faith in the U.S. election. Don't fall for it. Because as of the October 10th, 2016 issue of Time magazine, the idea of Russia meddling was a hoax being put out by the Trump people to discredit the election. I have it right here. So that's what happens when you have the effect of fake news in political campaigns. Now, speaking of Russia, where did this Russia thing come from? Early in the Trump campaign, it was clear there was going to be a break from the foreign policy of recent Republican presidents, especially the Bushes. Trump actually agreed with President Obama about Putin. Remember, Mitt Romney in the 2012 debates had said that Putin and Russia were the #1 geopolitical threat to the United States. And Barack Obama responded, hey, the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back. Chris Matthews and Rachel Maddow on MSNBC ridiculed Republicans anytime they suggested that Putin was a threat, saying they were trying to bring back the Cold War. Trump, in the campaign, criticized NATO for failing to deal with the threat of Islamofascist terrorism, and NATO allies for failing to live up to their treaty obligations. They're supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on national defense. That's effectively their dues as members of NATO, and only 5 of the 28 countries were paying that. And Trump criticized that. By the way, I've been criticizing that for decades. And I'm not anti-NATO. I wanted people to live up to their NATO obligations. Trump attacked the Iraq War. Remember, his most formidable opponent within the party was Jeb Bush. Trump even suggested at one point that George W. Bush had lied about WMDs in Iraq. So Trump's opponents saw an opening. They could paint Trump as pro-Putin for not wanting to go to war with Putin, and anti-NATO for being critical of NATO. So to dig up dirt, anti-Trump Republicans hired a research group called Fusion GPS, which was run by a former Wall Street Journal reporter. By the time Trump secured the nomination and Jeb Bush and the other Republicans had been knocked out, then the funding of the project was taken over by Hillary supporters. In June 2016, Fusion GPS hired a former British intelligence agent named Christopher Steele. That's him in the fuzzy picture. And Steele dug up a story that goes like this. Donald Trump is staying at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow. He finds out that the bed in his suite was used by the Obamas. He hates the Obamas so much that he has 2 prostitutes use the bathroom on the bed to defile it. This is recorded by Russian intelligence, which uses it to turn Trump into a Russian spy, with campaign aides traveling off to places like Prague for secret meetings with their Russian spy masters. The Steele report became known as the Dirty Dossier. So if you hear the Dirty Dossier, that's what we're talking about. And yes, that's the foundation for the Russia scandal. Among those in the government who wanted to spy on Donald Trump, that story, that he was a Russian spy, gave them the cover they needed. Hey, they're just investigating a national security matter, like when Nixon had those people break into the Watergate to see if the Democrats were getting money from Fidel Castro. Literally the same justification was used to spy on Trump. So the great thing about political humor is it doesn't have to have any basis in truth. And you see that, this is the kind of thing that you saw, and of course all the political comedy shows hit on this constantly. At one point, Stephen Colbert said that Trump and Putin had I'll clean it up, a homosexual relationship, and that's the way that's the way this game is played. So let's get back to politics. I mentioned the Clinton campaign's overconfidence and lack of seriousness as a reason for the Clintons' defeat. Let me give you another example. In a presidential campaign, saying you won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote is nothing to brag about. You may not like it, you may not think it's fair, but it's how the game is played. By the way, they use a similar system in the UK, in Canada, and many other countries. Basically, we just took a parliament and we split it into an electoral college to elect the national political leader and a Congress that does the legislation. In most countries, it's the same body, but it's essentially the same system. And so people who say the electoral college is something that no other country has, that's not really true. It's actually common among democracies. Now, bragging about winning the popular vote is kind of like the 1960 World Series. The New York Yankees bragging about how they got twice as many hits as the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1960, but of course the Pirates won. So you don't brag about how many hits you got if you lose the game. Nixon got more popular votes than JFK in 1960. And if you don't believe that, go to my website. I have a story which, again, no one has refuted. The Wall Street Journal looked into it and came to the same conclusion that I did, which is that votes were miscounted in Alabama. And if you count the votes correctly in Alabama, then Nixon actually won the popular vote. And by the way, in 2016, right-of-center candidates total got more votes than left-of-center candidates. So, you know, people on the left who brag about Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote should also know that the right-of-center candidates overall got more votes. Remember, this is the second time that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the election. The first time was when she got more votes than Barack Obama for the Democratic nomination. The Obama people carefully studied the primary map, understood the rules, maximized their resources to pick up delegates. On the other hand, as reported by Time magazine, during a strategy meeting for the 2008 campaign, Clinton's chief strategist, Mark Penn, pointed to California on the calendar and predicted that Clinton winning all of California's delegates would put her over the top. The only problem was California didn't have a winner-take-all system, which any political professional would know. I mean, that's just like not knowing how many points a field goal is and you're a football coach. Similarly, in 2016, Bernie Sanders got 43% of the vote and 46% of the real delegates, not counting the superdelegates, which are basically a cheat. I was on the Rules Committee of the Republican National Committee many years ago, 1980, and we actually voted to get rid of superdelegates back then because we considered it cheating. So how bad was the Clinton campaign in the fall? Throughout the year, Hillary visited California time and time again. They had at least 70 fundraisers in California with stars like Elton John. They raised more than $100 million. They ended up raising and spending about twice as much as the Trump campaign. And Hillary carried California by 30 points, which gave her her popular vote margin. Without that, Trump wins by 1.2 points nationally if you take out California. And so the Clinton campaign just kept pounding and pounding on running up the score in California, which in an electoral college system doesn't do you any good. In mid-October, Mother Jones magazine exulted. A confident Clinton campaign directs resources to Arizona and Texas. The campaign is reaching beyond the states it needs to win the presidential election. So they figured they had it in the bag, and now they're going to go after states that they really don't need. She actually went to Arizona less than a week before the election. Reading these stories, I feel like, you know, you're watching a horror movie and you want to say, "Don't go in there," because this is just such an obvious blunder, and you can't believe these people are doing this. Now, this is an SEIU bus. Obviously, this is from 2012. I couldn't find a more recent picture, but just to give you an idea. Here's a report from the newspaper Politico. Everybody could see Hillary Clinton was cooked in Iowa. So when, a week and a half out, the Service Employees International Union started hearing anxiety out of Michigan, union officials decided to reroute their volunteers. They started prepping meals and organizing hotel rooms. But when they called Clinton headquarters, Brooklyn was furious. "Turn that bus around," the Clinton team ordered SEIU. Those volunteers needed to stay in Iowa to fool Donald Trump into competing there, not drive to Michigan, where the Democrats' models projected a 5-point win up until the morning of Election Day. One Democratic operative explained, he said, they believed that they were more experienced, which they were. They believed they were smarter, which they weren't. Then there's Wisconsin, where the Democrats' miscalculations go back several years. Governor Scott Walker had pushed through changes that weakened government employee unions, which sparked recall campaigns directed at Walker and several other officials. Republicans won all those fights. Emboldened, they passed a right-to-work law, meaning that no one could be forced to join or pay dues to a union as a condition of employment. The Walker reforms cost the union some $600 million in dues over 5 years. Money that would probably have made the difference in this election. By the way, the Clinton people made fun of the Trump campaign for going in the final days to campaign in Minnesota, which the Democrats had carried since 1972. And sure enough, Trump lost Minnesota by about a point and a half. But what the Clintonites didn't appreciate was that Trump's campaigning in Minneapolis was broadcast right into central Wisconsin. So his trip to Minnesota helped him win Wisconsin. Trump won the state by less than 23,000 votes. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, got 31,000 votes. That's how close it was. Hillary did not visit Wisconsin once during the fall campaign, which led to this snarky headline in the Washington Examiner. Hillary Clinton blames voter suppression for losing a state she didn't visit once during the election. I should mention another factor that led to Hillary's loss, one that's common to favorites fighting underdogs. The underdog wins far more than you would expect. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book on asymmetric conflict, David and Goliath, cited the work of a political scientist who examined wars in the past 200 years in which one side was at least 10 times as powerful as the other side. The underdog won 28.5% of the time. But when the underdog refused to fight by the standard rules, say engaging in guerrilla warfare, or when David took off his helmet, took off his chainmail, put down his sword, and picked up some stones. In cases where they didn't go by the rules, the underdog won 63.6% of the time. So Canada, fighting by unconventional rules, would be a favorite fighting the United States, based on what we know from the last 200 years. The Trump movement had its roots, by the way, among people who had spent decades fighting by unconventional means. I trace it back to a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. She was a political activist from Illinois. She published a book in 1964 called A Choice, Not an Echo. Sold it out of her garage, ended up selling 3 million copies. It was the first serious attack on the political establishment, which was depicted as foisting in the Republican Party one country club liberal Republican candidate after another on an increasingly conservative party. From 1936 on, grassroots conservatives kept getting stepped on. The Republicans would nominate Wendell Willkie and Thomas Dewey and so on. And that split would eventually put Ronald Reagan against Gerald Ford in 1976 and against George H.W. Bush in 1980. By the way, Schlafly lived to a ripe old age and endorsed Trump in this last election, and that made it comfortable for a lot of movement conservatives to move into the Trump column who had not been comfortable up to that point. She died in September before she saw the results, but she was very critical in the election. The guy in the picture with Phyllis right there is Richard Viguerie. Richard Viguerie was the guy who invented political direct mail. He figured out how to use computers in politics on a scale that had never been done before. That's him many years ago. I think that's People magazine profiling him. And in fact, it was so important that John F. Kennedy Jr.'s magazine, George, named it one of the 100 key political moments in American political history. And it allowed grassroots organizations to break away from dependence on wealthy donors. You could raise money in lots of small contributions rather than a few big contributions. So when Bernie Sanders talked about the $27 contributions that funded his campaign, that's what he's talking about. So what Richard Viguerie invented made it possible for Bernie Sanders to run for president. I worked with Viguerie for a number of years to formulate what we called populist conservatism. It was launched with an article in the Washington Post in 1983 entitled America's Ruling Class Has Got to Go. And we went on with the book, The Establishment versus the People, which was on the Wall Street Journal list of the most interesting books of 1984. We created an organization called the Populist Conservative Tax Coalition that was kind of a precursor to the Tea Party movement, and that was the platform there, which I wrote. And then we also followed that up with a book on George H.W. Bush in 1992. The idea was to create a political party, a movement that would be a party of the people. Thomas Jefferson, in an 1824 letter, noted that everywhere people are allowed to think, speak, and write, you end up with one party that represents the elites, the aristocrats, and another party that represents regular people. Our goal was to create a party, a movement that would represent regular people. Now, no one perfectly aligned with what we were trying to do, but some of our ideas made it into various campaigns. Pat Buchanan used some of our ideas in the 1992 primaries when he ran against President Bush. Ross Perot, that fall, his campaign got 19% of the vote, and that's Ross Perot there. I think that's Hillary's baby grown up. And Some of the ideas made it into the Contract with America, which Newt Gingrich, the platform that Newt Gingrich used to get Republicans into a majority in the House for the first time in 40 years. In 1998, Jesse Ventura got elected governor of Minnesota as the candidate of Perot's party, the Reform Party, using some of those ideas. And he was very close to Trump in those days, by the way. So by 2000, with the election of George W. Bush, the Republican Party, at that point, those efforts at populism were really abandoned. The party became more a coalition of religious conservatives and big business, with the libertarians and the populists sort of shoved to the side. And then, of course, Obama comes along. There's the disenchantment with the Iraq War, and there's the financial crisis. And then after Obama comes in, very shortly you have a revival of this populist effort called the Tea Party movement, working against higher taxes and so on. And that helped the Republicans take control of the House in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. Now, there, of all people, to take advantage of this, because he wasn't part of it for most of that time, was Donald Trump. The Trump campaign didn't spring out of the blue. Trump's been running for president since 1987 or so. Here he is speaking in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at the Chamber of Commerce. The guy in the picture with him is Mike Dunbar, and the letter there is them talking about getting to Trump writing him saying we need to get together after the 1988 election and plan our strategy. Trump had, long before he expressed an interest in running for anything, he was mentored by Roy Cohn, who was, of course, known as the associate of Joe McCarthy. That's one reason that Trump makes my lefty friends go crazy, because they know of this association with Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was an arch villain in Angels in America. That's Al Pacino and then Meryl Streep as the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg, going after Roy Cohn on his deathbed, and that's how evil he was seen by people on the left. The Washington Post reported that Cohn, quote, showed Trump how to exploit power and instill fear through a simple formula: attack, counterattack, and never apologize. Now, he died in 1986, and by 1988, Trump was under the tutelage of Roger Stone, who spoke at the AG, for those who were there, you may remember. The picture in the lower left corner is from 1985. Roger Stone's in the middle. Lee Atwater, who was the campaign manager for George Bush in 1992, he's on the right, and the guy on the left in that picture down there is Paul Manafort, who was briefly the head of the Trump campaign this past summer of 2016. In 1988, Trump was already developing the themes on trade and NATO that would show up when he finally ran for real 27 years later. And in fact, rumors were floated at the Republican convention in 1988 that George Bush might pick him as a sort of an out-of-the-box running mate, mainly floated by Trump. In 1999 and 2000, Trump ran briefly for the nomination of Ross Perot's old party, the Reform Party. There he is with Jesse Ventura. Eventually dropped out of the Reform Party race, noting, among other reasons, that David Duke, as I said, had moved into the party, didn't want to be associated with him. Even after dropping out, though, Trump won the Reform Party primaries in Michigan and California. So it's kind of a nice trivia question, you know, what were the first primaries that Trump won and when were they? It was in 2000 when he won the Reform Party primaries in 2 states. In 2016, some analysts, in fact, would describe Trump as a third-party candidate who happened to run as a Republican, and there's a lot of truth to that. In 2016, in fact, only one of the 5 living Republican presidential candidates supported Trump. That was Bob Dole, who was 93 at that time and who is a party guy above everything else. Helping move people at the grassroots, working class people and small business class people especially, into the Trump column was the last on my list of Clinton blunders: the attack on the deplorables. I know exactly where it came from. Saul Alinsky, the great political provocateur and organizer, Hillary Rodham wrote her thesis on him, and he called her his friend. One of Alinsky's rules for radicals, as he called them, was to demonize your opponents. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. That was one of his rules. Another, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. In other words, go after people, not institutions, because people can be hurt, cut off from their support, easier than you can hurt institutions. Paint people as just bad, beyond the pale. Create their images for them. Once there was a group of students who were planning to disrupt a speech by George H.W. Bush when he was UN ambassador. This was during the Vietnam War. They were going to picket or disrupt the speech, but Alinsky said, no, 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 no. Dress up like members of the Ku Klux Klan. And whenever Bush says something in support of the war, cheer and wave signs saying, the KKK supports Bush, which is what they did to great success. So one tactic is to look at your opponent's millions of supporters, find someone who is despicable, and make that the image that sticks in people's heads. Speaking to a crowd of rich people in New York, it was an LGBT fundraiser with Barbra Streisand, Hillary on September 9th said, you know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? Laughter, applause. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. Now, I was saying it like she did, in sort of a sing-song way there, as if either, I don't know whether she didn't really believe it or she just got tired of saying it, but she said it that way. Almost as if she didn't believe it. Now, she followed this up with comments that were perfectly reasonable, that although the deplorables are irredeemable, the other basket of Trump supporters are people who feel that the government has let them down, the economy has let them down, nobody cares about them, nobody worries about what happens to their lives and their futures, they're just desperate for change. They don't buy everything he says, but he seems to hold out some hope that their lives will be different. These are people we have to understand and empathize with as well. But of course, it's the soundbite that counts, just as when Mitt Romney said that 47% of people were not susceptible to a tax cut message because they don't pay taxes, and that was the thing that everybody remembered, but they remembered it as an attack on half the voters, and that's how people remembered what Hillary had said. And it gave Trump supporters an identity as the targets of condescension of privileged people. And I have here the shirt. The T-shirt. Team Deplorables. So people were identifying as deplorables. So really they had not had something to identify as up to that point. They became the deplorables. And in fact, the little ad there that says deplorable that's in the corner down the bottom on the right, that's an actual Trump ad because the Trump campaign picked up on this and were using it. And if you don't understand why Trump people felt so mistreated, so quick to identify as deplorables, you may have missed the Facebook memes that were going around even early in the year 2016, like these. Broken Ford behind meth lab. Yeah, that's not racist or anything. I mean, this is how Trump people were depicted. And like this. By the way, those two guys are British serial killers. They have nothing to do with the Trump campaign. By the way, you should know that Trump's comment about the poorly educated, he was listing all the groups he had won, which included the highly educated and the poorly educated and various ethnic groups and so on. And he gets to the part about the poorly educated and he says, we won with the poorly educated. I love the poorly educated. Reason magazine, the libertarian magazine, responded with this, Trump, I love the poorly educated. So should the other candidates. Here's something else. According to general election exit polls in 2008 and 2012, people without a high school diploma were by far Barack Obama's strongest education cohort. Obama carried them by 28 points in 2008 and 29 points in 2012. In both elections, Obama's share of the vote declined as one moved up the educational ladder. That pattern was broken only with people in the most educated component, those that had done postgraduate work. Otherwise, the more educated you were, the less likely you were to vote for the Democrats. We shouldn't be surprised to see a headline like this. Study reveals nearly half of Clinton's deplorables once supported her. There was a time when liberals like Eleanor Roosevelt, Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy campaigned among the poorly educated, coal miners, for example. There was actually an effort by liberals 4 years ago to start the Bobby Kennedy Project. And it was shot down. It was abandoned soon after it was started. And a contributing factor was that people didn't want to be associated with those kind of people. University of Virginia political scientist Jeff Skelly explained, at this point, the trade-offs that they might have to make to attract more working-class white voters may not be worth the cost in irritating the constituencies of their current coalition. And, I think of, if you see the TV show Billions on Showtime, there's a moment where the U.S. attorney who's trying to get his staff not to be complacent, and he talks about how he was a rising chess student and was expected to start winning all the tournaments. And he said he had a flaw. If I decided that my opponent wasn't worthy, a dark rage would come over me, and the rage would become the driver. All the strategy, patience, and practice would vanish, and I would begin obsessing about total destruction. But then, while I was trying to destroy him, I'd forget to win. And one final note. There's a fellow named Emmett Rinson who used to write for the publication Vox. He hates Trump. He actually lost his job by asking people to start violence at Trump events. Yet he took Trump seriously. In April 2016, he warned that Trump might win, largely because of what he called the smug style in American liberalism. He wrote, finding comfort in the notion that their former allies were disdainful, hapless rubes, smug liberals created a culture animated by that contempt. And he said the wages of smug is Trump. Who's responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat? Clinton and her campaign people have no one to blame but themselves. So, thank you very much.